I am honoured by your presence here today, and I am terribly sorry that so many of your daughters, mothers, sisters and aunties have tragically passed away as a result of domestic violence. That this plague of domestic violence, homicides, relentlessly courses through our community in the Northern Territory is our horror and our national shame. The number of domestic violent deaths in the Northern Territory is truly shocking. My office is aware of at least 87 domestic violence deaths of women, most of them are Aboriginal women, over the last 24 years. Appallingly, 8 Aboriginal women have died since June this year, and a sister girl has also died. And all of these 9 deaths are allegedly from domestic violence. The grief and trauma across our communities flowing from this traumatic loss of life is inexhaustible. To the children, parents, siblings, extended families and communities who have lost a member to domestic violence, I am sorry. Of course, the number of deaths does not begin to tell the true story of the extent of domestic violence. Each death examined in this inquest was preceded by years, decades even, of other acts of harassment, control and violence. In the Territory, the rates of reported domestic violence are more than 3 times the national average, and less than 10% of all incidents of domestic violence are ever reported to the police. Not only is the violence more relentless in the Territory, it is more vicious. More weapons are used, and the injuries inflicted on victims result in high rates of hospitalisation. Domestic and family violence is present in our homes, on our streets, in our shopping centres and parks, on our beaches and at our bus stops. It is happening right now. Right now, 000 calls are being made and first responders in police cars and ambulances are being dispatched. Statistics are numbers, but the people they count are not. Those people include the 4 women whose lives and deaths were examined in these inquests. All of these women were daughters and sisters and aunties, and some of them were mothers. Together, their stories help us understand the nature of the problem. Miss Yunupiŋu was a Yolngu woman born in Yirrkala in 1989 to a mother from the Ragurrk clan and Dua moiety, and to a father of the Gummich clan and Yirritja moiety. Her mother's country was Dalamboy. Miss Yunupiŋu started going out with Garawoi Neil Marawika when she was just 15 years old and he was 21. His family was respected, but like many children raised in community, he was exposed from a young age to problematic drinking and violence. He started abusing alcohol when he was 16 years old, and so his problematic use of alcohol was already well entrenched when he met Miss Yunupiŋu. The violence that she suffered at his hands started almost immediately. When she was just 16, he almost killed her, but she was taken to hospital and with medical treatment she survived. She endured and survived years of abuse, but succumbed to her injuries and passed away on 4 October 2018 when Mr. Marika stabbed her 3 times with a large steak knife. She was 29 years old. Ngyego Ragurrk was born in Darwin in 1979. Her large family are members of the Mirangangu tribe in the Kumanjayi clan, and their country includes the lands and waters of Junction Bay and Arla Bay between Goulburn Island and Maningrida. She was a traditional owner of those lands and a Jungay with responsibility to manage those lands and waters. She was the only woman in her tribe who knew the names of all the sacred sites and totems on her country, and so with her passing, some of this sacred knowledge has been lost. She spoke Morn, Kumwinku and Kumbalan. Later she moved to Manmoy and became a Wardakum Ranger, working to protect native animals, biodiversity, culture such as rock art and the land. In 2016, when she was 37, she moved to Darwin and met Garsek Nawij, also known as Garsek Maureen, who was 35 years old. He too had witnessed violence and substance abuse growing up in his communities. He'd suffered from neglect as a child and commenced petrol sniffing when he was 10, but he later took to smoking ganja and drinking alcohol. By the time he met Ngyego, he had been to jail many times, including for violent offending against a previous partner, and he had just been released when he met her. The domestic violence with Ngyego started almost immediately, with police being called to an incident on 18 January 27. Ngyego endured and survived his violence and coercive controlling behaviours until the 23rd of December 2019. On that night, she was horrifically beaten, drowned and strangled at Darwin's Mindle Beach, and she passed away in the early hours of 24 December 2019. When police attended, he lied to them about what he had done. She was 40 years old. Kumarn Rubuntja was born and raised in Alice Springs in 1974 and was a strong Western Arrernte girl and woman. She was a founding member and leader of the Tangentyere Women's Family Safety Group, which campaigns against domestic violence. And in 2019, she was elected president of the Andapa Town Camp. She managed these achievements even though she herself was the victim of horrendous domestic violence across a number of relationships over many years, commencing in 1999. In 2019, when she was 44, she started a relationship with Malcolm Abbott, also known as Malcolm Tapora. He was 3 years older than she was and had a long history of alcohol abuse and criminal offending, including shocking violence against women. Over a 25-year period from 1993, he spent 20 years in jail, including for killing a woman in 1996, causing serious harm to a previous partner when he stabbed her 4 times with a knife, an assault with bolt cutters on his sister-in-law, and the stabbing of another female partner. The domestic violence with Kumarn started early in their relationship, with the first 000 call to police being made on the 16th of May 2019. Kumarn endured and survived his violence and coercively controlling behaviour until 7 January 2021. That night she spoke to a family member on the phone and said, "Malcolm is half killing me, and I can't tell you where I am because Malcolm is going to hit me in the car." When she was sitting in the car park of Alice Springs Hospital, Mr. Abbott repeatedly ran over her and left her for dead. He then went home and lied to his family about it. Kumarn passed away at 46 years of age. Kumanjayi Haywood was born in 1987 at Alice Springs Hospital, but she grew up in Tennant Creek. She was an Aliwa woman and was always very close to her mother. She was just 13 years old when she met Kumanjayi Dixon, who was 16. The relationship continued on and off for the next 21 years. Violence was first brought to the attention of the police 2 years into the relationship, but likely started earlier. In total, there were 47 incidents between the couple reported to police. Most of the violence was perpetrated by Kumanjayi Dixon, but sometimes Kumanjayi Haywood behaved violently. Kumanjayi Dixon was jailed many times, but that did not deter him. Kumanjayi Dixon was jailed many times, but that did not deter him. Kumanjayi Haywood endured and survived his violence and coercively controlling behaviour until 4 November 2021. On that day, the couple were drinking together, and Kumanjayi Haywood sent a text to a family member that read, "Kumanjayi Dixon is going to kill me tonight. Love you so much. Don't cry for me, babe." When they later returned to a home in Hidden Valley Camp, Kumanjayi Dixon started assaulting and jealousing Kumanjayi Haywood. She ran to a toilet and locked the door, trying to protect herself. When she refused to come out, he poured petrol under the door and ignited it. Kumanjayi Haywood sustained burns to 90% of her body and passed away on the 7th of November 2021. She was 34 years old. Kumanjayi Dixon passed away from his burns on 13 November 2021. For those who aren't familiar with the term or concept of jealousing, it is a behaviour which is often used as a form of coercive control. Those ladies and their life stories are 4 of the 86 domestic violence deaths the Coroner's Office knows about since 2000. In my findings, I briefly recount the horror endured by a further 68 women. I will mention just 3 of those 68. M's partner became angry when she interrupted him, so to give her a fright, he punched, kicked and stamped on her. Wearing boots, he kicked her on the face, head and chest and stabbed her to the leg with a sharpened stick. This prolonged attack caused multiple rib fractures, hemorrhages to her lung and brain, and lacerations and bruising all over her head and body, and she passed away. C and her family argued over jealousy matters, and he punched her to the face, causing her head to hit the wall. Later that night, he stabbed her to the arm and leg before fleeing. The stab wound to her arm cut her auxiliary artery, and she died from catastrophic bleeding within minutes. L's partner beat her to the head with a number of large rocks. She begged him, "Don't hit me, I'm your wife." But he continued the attack. She died from a subarachnoid hemorrhage to the brain. All of these women lived and were loved. Shirlene Campbell, coordinator of the Tarngera Women's Family Safety Group, eloquently lamented in 2021, "We are not just numbers. We are not invisible women. Our sister, another one lost to us, is not just a number, and we will not let her be invisible." The numbers of women counted in the Coroner's Office do not include missing women, and they do not include deaths likely closely connected to, but not directly caused by domestic violence, such as suicides. In the future, I am sure we will also count these women, and the picture will be even bleaker. This is not just an unfolding tragedy for those families most directly affected. It is an existing tragedy for our community and our agencies and institutions that work to serve our community. It affects the Northern Territory every single day. Let's think for a moment about the impact on some of our agencies. The 10% of domestic violence that is reported consumes enormous resources in responses. Up to 80% of police time is directed towards domestic violence. 60% of the work of public prosecutors is consumed by domestic violence. And 63% of our prisoners in our jails are inside for domestic and family violence offences. Our young police constables are exhausted. Our courts are struggling to cope, and the jails are overflowing. I want to put that prison statistic in context. The Northern Territory has by far the highest imprisonment rate in Australia. We are currently imprisoning about 1,100 prisoners per 100,000 adult population. The state that comes closest to our shocking statistic is Western Australia, and their rate is about 303 prisoners per 100,000 adult population. We are more than triple that. The United States has the highest national imprisonment rate in the world at about 531 prisoners per 100,000 adult population. We are more than double that. We have one of the highest imprisonment rates in the world. As the evidence in this inquest establish, we can imprison domestic violence offenders over and over again at great financial cost, and it is not making any difference. A growing prison population is one clear measure of our failure, because for every additional prisoner who has perpetrated domestic violence, we have yet another victim who we have failed to protect. Alice Springs Hospital was inundated and almost overwhelmed when it experienced a 77% monthly increase in domestic violence assault presentations after alcohol restrictions were lifted. There are insufficient safe houses for women and children escaping domestic violence, and where those services exist, there are not enough workers and not enough beds, and it is not uncommon that women at risk are turned away. It is estimated that domestic and family violence costs the Northern Territory community somewhere between $457 million and $606 million every single year. And what about our children? The developmental damage being suffered by children exposed to domestic violence is difficult to quantify, but cannot be overlooked or underestimated. It's not only a terrible blight on their lives, but also directly on ours, because we know that 94% of the very youngest children in detention, 10 to 13-year-olds, have been exposed to family violence. When children do not feel safe at home, they move out into the streets and join forces with other similarly traumatised children. Most children are in detention for repeat and serious property offending committed when in company with other young persons, and the community is reeling from this offending, most notably here in Alice Springs. Sadly, without serious interventions, these children will likely grow into adults who use violence. However, shockingly, there are currently no pre-court diversion-specific programs for children who are exposed to or are perpetrating domestic violence. We seem very quick to blame kids and parents, but I'm going to repeat what I just said. There are currently no pre-court diversion-specific programs for children who are exposed to or are perpetrating domestic violence. And who is responsible for this failure? And what are the consequences for those children in desperate need? And for all of us. The response of many individuals to working to turn this tide is often heroic and often at the expense of their own well-being. As a community, we extend our gratitude and thanks to those working tirelessly to respond to this plague. But in spite of every individual's heroic efforts, we must frankly acknowledge that our agencies, government and non-government, are failing to turn the tide. Our combined responses are too narrow, too piecemeal, too small, too ineffective, and they are often culturally ill-informed and culturally inappropriate. Imagine for a moment calling 000 in an emergency, knowing that the call will be answered by someone who does not speak your language and there is no interpreter. Do you make the call? And if you do, how will you communicate? Early in these inquests, Acting Deputy Commissioner Michael White said, "We are at an epidemic proportion that I can't see a way out of unless there is radical change." When I heard that statement, I very much believed it to be true. But having received all the evidence and considered the detailed submissions, I no longer think that radical is the way to describe it. I have made 35 recommendations, and I don't think any of them are radical. None of them are new. They all build on and are informed by the work that is already being done by our academic experts, the managers and frontline staff working every day in the domestic violence sector, the police, health, territory, families and corrections, executives and workers. And most importantly, they are informed by the family of those who have passed away and community members with lived experience. If the task seems too big or overwhelming and this all sounds impossible, if anyone is feeling defeated, there is actually good news. With all this combined input, we know what needs to be done, and there is no reason for any further delay before action is taken. In 2022, the Domestic Family and Sexual Violence Interagency and Reform Office, which I will call ICRO, was established with high-level representatives from our frontline agencies, police, health, justice, education, and territory families as it was then known. Applying agency expertise, and following extensive, comprehensive, collaborative, consultative, cross-agency effort, ICRO produced a detailed mapping report which identified the prevalence of domestic and family violence, identified gaps and opportunities for reform in each agency, proposed specific reforms, and prepared a thorough budget for the minimum action to be taken to curb the rates of domestic and family violence. The minimum response was $180 million over 5 years, and the current government has committed to that minimum financial response. How and where the money should be expended has been carefully identified by those agencies in alignment with the Northern Territory Domestic and Family Violence Reduction Framework and its action plans, and the Risk Assessment and Management Framework. Given the urgency of the situation, the cross-agency expertise that was applied, and the extent and expense of the work already undertaken, and given the current government has already accepted the bottom line and committed to expending $180 million over 5 years, I am making a sensible recommendation that there be a permanent ICRO to lead consistent and evidence-based domestic, family and sexual violence policy and practice, and to guide health, housing and community services to address domestic, family and sexual violence. This is not radical. It is reinstating a cross-agency lead that is tried and proven to work effectively. ICRO should produce an annual report to the Minister that is published publicly online, which informs the community of progress on work done and on domestic violence statistics, so it's easy for everyone to see if the responses to domestic violence are having an impact. The $180 million that has already been publicly committed should urgently be made available to the sector in accordance with the full mapping report of ICRO. Given the recent loss of life and the extent of the horror, no further delay can be tolerated. But government agencies are only half the story. Women's safety services, such as crisis accommodation and support services, men's services, such as healing and men's behaviour change programs, rehabilitation services and Aboriginal community-controlled organisations and other community service providers are all part of the matrix of essential and vital services working to respond to and prevent the harm of domestic and family violence. These not-for-profit, non-government agencies are operating on the front line of response with a minimum of staff and resources. They are often separated from each other by great distance and so tend to work in silos. They struggle to advocate for their needs. They are precariously funded and most often are underfunded. And in the current environment, they struggle to develop and deliver a coordinated response. The domestic family violence not-for-profit sector have advocated for a peak representative body to coordinate their efforts to achieve meaningful and lasting change. There is absolutely nothing radical about a peak body for domestic and family violence. Queensland has one, it's called QCOS. New South Wales has one, it's called Domestic Violence New South Wales. Victoria has one, it's called Safe and Equal. South Australia has one, it's called Embolden. Tasmania has one, it's called TASCOS. Western Australia has one, it's called Stopping Violence, Family Violence. And a national body sits in the ACT and it's called WESNET. In fact, it is only the Northern Territory which experiences the highest rates of domestic violence in the country that does not have a peak body. This makes no sense and must change. A peak body will assist the sector to be strategic and well organised, and it will facilitate communication between the sector and the government. The NT Council of Social Service, NTCOS, has commenced designing a model for a peak body for domestic family and sexual violence services in the Northern Territory. I recommend that a peak body should be established and adequately funded. I am convinced that with an ICRO and a peak body, almost all the changes that are necessary can be confidently and responsibly and urgently implemented. The inquest sat for 34 days. I received oral evidence from 95 witnesses and statements from many more. Lengthy briefs of evidence were tendered. Agency reviews and institutional responses were received and considered. Detailed and helpful submissions were made by counsel assisting and on behalf of 3 of the families. Northern Territory Police, Department of Children and Families, Northern Territory Health, Northern Territory Correctional Services, Crimes Victims Services Unit, the Gillen Club and a former police constable all made submissions. There was commitment, seriousness, perseverance, intellectual rigour, generosity and goodwill between the interested parties and towards the inquest. I was greatly assisted by a variety of insights and a desire to find real, practical and achievable solutions. Having carefully considered all of the evidence and all of the submissions, I have made 35 recommendations. The recommendations are specific, practicable and in most instances supported by the agencies to whom they are directed. I will just mention 3 further matters. We cannot arrest our way out of this problem. While police must necessarily be first responders to incidents of violence or potential violence, it cannot fall on them alone to keep women safe. Timely, wraparound, follow-up safety services are required. Currently, there is often a critical time gap between police attendance and access to follow-up services. This time gap creates an opportunity for women to be lost to the safety network and for perpetrators to fly under the radar and avoid being held to account. NT Police have committed to trialling a co-responder model which will involve an initial response from general duty police officers, promptly followed by a team consisting of a specialist domestic violence worker and a police officer well trained in domestic violence. The co-response will be directed to both the victim and the perpetrator. Such a model is designed to improve the safety of the victim and address the behaviour of the offender with a view to reducing offending in the future. If successful, the model should also permit frontline police to spend more time on their core functions. There is nothing new about a co-responder model. It's not radical. It's already used in the NT for mental health responses and for some sexual assault matters. I heard that co-responder models are underway in Queensland and evaluations are positive. However, for such a model to be successful, it must be properly funded and resourced. The Queensland Police Service has $229 million over 4 years committed to the trial. A Department of Children and Families executive has costed the implementation of co-responder models in the NT at $1 million each year for each location. Completely inconsistent with the extent and urgency of the domestic violence problem, a paltry $300,000 has been allocated to the single co-responder pilot site in Alice Springs. Without adequate funding, the pilot is set up to fail and the $300,000 will be wasted in the endeavour. Accordingly, I've recommended the pilot be further and sufficiently funded so that it can be fully implemented and independently evaluated. During the course of these inquests, I have appreciated the opportunity to better understand the complexity of domestic and family violence. It is far from straightforward, and our learnings and understandings have considerably progressed and benefited from thoughtful academic research. Very specific understandings and skills are required of police to consistently respond well to complex charged domestic violence call-outs. Northern Territory Police, Northern Territory Health and domestic violence experts, most importantly Dr. Shay Brown, have worked to develop and provide a domestic and family violence training package known as PART, P-A-R-T, Prevent, Assist, Respond Training. Given the amount of time police spend dealing with domestic violence, this training is critical. But there is certainly nothing radical about updating police training to ensure that it reflects current knowledge and to ensure that it adequately prepares recruits for their working life. And there is certainly nothing radical about providing sufficient funding to ensure all police receive the training they need to do their job well. Although this training has already commenced, its continuing implementation and evaluation has been costed at $1.8 million over 5 years, and there has not yet been a commitment to a long-term funding strategy to the police. I recommend that it should be properly funded and made available to all forward-facing police. Additionally, although NT Health was significantly involved in the development of the training, it is not committed to implementing it at this stage, and for the reasons explained in my findings, I'm recommending that NT Health also commit to part training for its staff. Finally, if there is to be a solution to this problem, it lies with the men who are choosing to use violence. They must stop blaming someone else, take responsibility, and change their attitudes and behaviours. For each man, making those changes might be quite radical, but it's certainly not radical to understand that they will need longer-term help, support and education to make those changes and to make them stick long-term. There is a paucity of work being done with men, but we know the kind of work that needs to be done. Signs are positive for those men fortunate enough to secure a place in one of the limited men's behaviour change programs which currently operate in Darwin and Alice Springs and with limited reach into 2 communities, or in a culturally appropriate men's healing program which are also limited. These programs desperately need to be funded adequately so they can be expanded in their current locations and into new locations. Similar appropriate programs should be delivered in prisons, but prison programs alone are not enough. I've made recommendations to give effect to increasing programs for men. Many leaders in the field have generously given their expertise to this inquest process. Thank you. I particularly wish to thank and acknowledge the workers at crisis shelters and counselling services around the Northern Territory, some of whom have given evidence in the inquest. I want to acknowledge the work of those who showed exceptional leadership in ICRO. I'm very grateful to the police who gave evidence, and most particularly to 3 officers who have demonstrated exceptional leadership in this area and who have been recognised by the domestic family violence sector for their care and expertise. At the time I heard evidence, they were Acting Deputy Commissioner Michael White, who is present today, and an Acting Assistant Commissioner and a Superintendent. To all counsel, but particularly to Counsel Assisting Dr Peggy Dwyer and to Miss Maria Walls, I sincerely thank you for your committed and productive endeavours in assisting me to investigate widely and understand deeply. To Miss Yunupiŋu's family, to Ngyego Ragurrk's family, to Kumarn Rubuntja's family, to Kumanjayi Haywood's family, thank you for entrusting us with their stories. In these inquests, we have talked about sad times, indeed the worst of times, and their tragic deaths. But I know that you remember them smiling and laughing, sharing stories and spending time on country and happy times with family. They lived and were loved. In handing down these findings, I will remember them that way too. I will now take appearances from counsel.
May it please the Court, do I, for the record, Your Honour, I appear as your counsel assisting, instructed by Ms Rawls.
May it please the Court, my name is Phyllis. I appear for the Prosecution Services. May it please the Court, my name is Noel. I appear for the Department of Children and Families.
May it please Your Honour, my name is Ragurrk. I appear with Ms Tomaszewski, who is on loan for the Northern Territory Police Force, instructed by Ms Lau. I should say to Your Honour that Commissioner Murphy of the Northern Territory Police Force is present on screen in Darwin, and Deputy Commissioner Dole and Assistant Commissioner White and Executive Director Little are all present in Alice Springs and the court before you as a mark of respect to you and also to the families.
Thank you, Dr. Freckleton.
Welcome, Your Honour. I'm appearing for the Yunupiŋu and Ragurrk family. Members of the Ragurrk family are present in the court in Darwin, and the CEO of the North Australian Aboriginal Family Legal Service is also here in person.
Thank you.
Your Honour, Luke Garden for the Gilbert.
Thank you.
May it please the court, Amy Rich from Narja, appearing on behalf of the family of Kumarn Rubuntja. We're really grateful to have Sarah Rubuntja in the court today, the daughter of Kumarn Rubuntja.
Thank you. And do we have appearances in Darwin? I think you're on mute, but I can see Mr. Hutton, and I'm assuming you're appearing for NT Health. We might not be able to fix that, but I note your appearance, Mr. Hutton. I now formally hand down my findings. There are some physical copies available to those in court, and my formal findings will be published online this morning. And I'll also take this opportunity to announce that I intend to conduct a further series of domestic violence inquests commencing in August 2025, which will provide an excellent opportunity to review progress on the implementation of these 35 recommendations. Court is adjourned.
Silence will stand. The Coroner's Court of the Northern Territory